Hello and welcome to Maple Flavored Yoga. My name is Andy and this is Dr. Claw. If you found your way to this video, I would greatly appreciate it if you click the subscribe button. That way you won't miss my new content I release every Monday. Also, click the like button and feel free to leave a comment below. These small, simple actions support me so I can continue creating free yoga content for you to enjoy, and I really appreciate it. This class is dedicated to learning the ins and outs of downward facing dog, also called Adho Mukha Svanasana in Sanskrit. This pose is very common in many yoga classes, so this is the opportunity to learn some variations and spend some time in this pose to see how it feels within your body, so when the teacher tells you to do downward facing dog or down dog or Adho Mukha Svanasana, you kind of know what you're in for. Though this pose will change from day to day within yourself, just like everyone else, so don't panic. We'll get right into it then. So as with any pose in yoga, it's really important to set yourself up so that you're not putting unnecessary strain on tendons or ligaments or muscles. So we want to try and keep that anatomical position in a normal, functional way so that we're not straining our bodies, which can eventually create injury. So when we have our feet, if you call these your feet, that's okay. When we're putting our hands on the mat, we want to have our hands shoulder width apart, and we want to have it so that our middle fingers are pointing forward. This will keep our hands and our shoulders and arms from internally rotating or externally rotating. If we had our hands out to the side like this, then we're going to be putting a lot of strain on our elbows and our wrists. So in this way, we're going to minimize the strain that we're putting onto our bodies. Obviously, there's going to be some, not necessarily strain, but there is load bearing that is going to happen when we're putting weight onto our hands. It's also really important to make sure before you're doing a lot of downward facing dog or putting a lot of weight on your hands that you're going to properly warm up your wrists and your forearms, which I will make another class for that. Getting there slowly but surely. So our middle fingers are going to be pointing forward. The palms of our hands are nice and firmly secured onto our mat. So one of the questions that sometimes people ask or they're not sure is how far their feet should be from their hands. So ideally, if you come into plank, this is how far your feet should be from your hands when you come into downward facing dog. Obviously, this can be adjusted, but that is kind of what you're shooting for. When we're in this pose, we want to make sure that our forearms are being pulled inwards and our upper arms are being rolled outwards. By doing this, it's making sure that we're utilizing the musculature of the arms instead of having this joint being really exposed and hyperextended. So when we're making sure that our forearms are rolling forward and our upper arms are rolling back, it's going to utilize the shoulder girdle, which is really supportive, and making sure, as I said, to use that musculature and avoid that hyperextension of your elbow. So we want to have our forearms rolling forward, upper back is rolling back. So if your arms are straight out like this, that means that you're putting too much strain on those elbows. So we don't want to have our shoulders way up by our ears. We want to have it so that our shoulder blades are rolling out to the side within reason. All of this is like within reason. You don't need to necessarily really like wrench your shoulder blades down the sides of your back. But you want to have that when you're rotating your shoulders back like that. As I said, you're going to be utilizing, recruiting a lot more muscles up into your shoulders and stabilizing that joint as well. So now that we have an idea of what the top half of our body should be doing, what's happening for the rest of our body? So I'll give you a side view here. So setting up with my plank. Coming into my downward facing dog. So with your downward facing dog, there are some people who have really flexible shoulders and backs, thoracic spines in particular. So there shouldn't be a really big curve in your back here. That is why you're using those upper back muscles to really knit everything together and create that nice, strong back. This isn't necessarily a back bend. You shouldn't be doing back bend when you're in this pose. When you're getting into something like puppy pose, where your heart is coming to the floor, that's different. But the purpose of downward facing dog isn't necessarily to get into a back bend. There are certain times through a flow where you're using downward facing dog that you might have a bit of a back bend when you're waving forward or something like that, or waving back. But if you're in your just a regular downward facing dog, you want to make sure that it's a really strong, almost like a triangle. You want to have a nice sturdy triangle. So sometimes, especially if it's my first downward dog of the day, I might not have as much flexibility in my shoulders, so I might not be as straight in my upper, from my hips down to my hands. And with your feet, you want to try and tend your heels to the floor. If your heels don't reach the floor, that's okay. If they're up like this, you just want to try and create that intention to try and elongate the lines down the backs of your legs. Also, if you have really tight hamstrings or lower legs, you can definitely bend your knees. You don't have to have your legs completely straight, especially if that's causing discomfort or if it's causing a lot of strain. Also, if you're having a lot of pain in your wrists, you can modify this by coming into dolphin, which is the same, it's a very similar shape, but you're gonna come onto your forearms as well, which I will show you. But as with any yoga pose, you want to listen to your body, and if you're creating a lot of tension in your body, that signals to your physical self that there could be danger around, so it's going to create even more tension. So that's why it's nice to find that minimum edge where you can feel that there is elongation or some type of activation, and then allow that to dissipate, especially when we're working with flexibility. That's why you don't want to push too hard into finding your maximum edge, because then you could create injury. Maybe your body's not ready to open up that deeply yet, or maybe ever. That's something that you may need to come to terms with. Sure, practice definitely helps you cultivate flexibility, but there's certain things that maybe your body will not be able to do no matter how much you practice. We all have limitations, so yeah, it's just something to keep in mind while you're moving through all of these different poses. So we're going to come into our downward dog. Maybe your wrists are getting sore, so you can bring your forearms to the mat, still keeping them shoulder width apart and still keeping those middle fingers forward. And it's a very similar shape. It's a little more intense in my shoulders anyway. I mean, everyone will experience these poses differently. But yeah, that is definitely an option for you. And as I said, you can always bend your knees if you're finding that it's a lot of really intense lengthening of the backs of your legs. So try out a few different variations and see what feels good for your body. We'll stay in this pose for a few breaths just to see how that feels. If at any time you need to take a break, you can always come into child's pose. When I'm in downward facing dog and I'm taking a few breaths, typically on my inhale, I come out of the pose a little bit to create space to take in that breath. And then on my exhale, I push my limbs into the mat, almost like I'm reaching into the floor. And then I am able to really elongate through the exhales. So inhale, I create space. Exhale, I really push energy and prana through my feet and my hands, almost like I'm reaching into the floor and tending my hands and my feet into the floor. Inhale, create space. Exhale, and I really let that elongation come down the backs of my legs. So there are so many different variations for downward facing dog. It's used a lot in many yoga classes. It's a very traditional pose, but you can really get creative with it. There's three-legged downward dog where you're lifting your foot up. You can add a twist where you're reaching back to grab your calf or your ankle. There's so many fun variations that you can play with this pose, and I really hope that you take advantage of them to explore how your body experiences them, what type of energy that creates within you, and all the time trying to keep in mind, what is your breath doing? Your breath will show you. Maybe if you can push a little harder, maybe you should back off a little bit. So yes, your breath is a very telling tool through any poses, but I find especially when I'm in downward facing dog, it is also an inversion, so where our heart is above our head, and there's a lot of great benefits to inversions as well. So downward facing dog is a tough pose. It is sometimes considered a resting pose. So if you're thinking that's absolutely ridiculous, this pose is impossible some days, I've been there. I still am there some days. Some days I love it, some days I hate it. It's just part of the yoga journey. So now we can just take a moment after practicing that pose, the Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog, and see what is our experience internally at this time. For me, typically I feel really powerful, I feel really spacious. There are some days though that I come out of downward dog and I feel really sluggish. So whatever your experience is, it's valid and there's no need to change that. I will leave you now. I just want to thank you so much for allowing me to assist in your yoga practice or your yoga journey in any way. And I want you to know that you are seen, you are loved, and you are divine. Take care.